So that's really where the evidence stands. Let's not for a minute fall into the trap of suggesting that there isn't a need for economic development in the developing countries. There's a quarter of the world's population without basic access to sanitation. There's 2 billion people living on less than $2 a day, the price of a cup of coffee. There is a need for economic development. Nobody's denying that. And let's also, for the sake of argument, let's admit that growth has done us some good, that we live in a civilized world, that we live in a place where health services are considerably better than they were, that our quality of life is better than it was decades ago. For the sake of argument, we should put all of those things on the table, and we could quite happily say yes, yes, yes to all of them. And yet it doesn't answer the question, how does that system continue to deliver an increasing quality of life, not just in the developed world, but in the poorer nations where it's desperately needed? So that's the basis of what Prosperity Without Growth is trying to do. That's the analysis which says it's difficult. The one key message that comes out of this, I think, is that actually you can't really tackle that issue without confronting the structure of the existing economy. And so that's one of the things that Prosperity Without Growth tries to do. I'm going to slightly heroically throw a little bit of that structure to you in a very simplified way. A lot is spoken about the engine of growth. Here's a little bit of what the engine of growth looks like. Firms produce goods for households, and they also provide them with incomes through employing them in households, and households spend those incomes buying more goods. That's a fantastically neat way of organising activity, and it seems to have been fairly successful. There's nothing in the diagram at the moment that suggests that it has to grow and grow and grow, but actually the dynamics does become a bit more complicated. The other things that consumers do with their incomes is, if you're lucky, although not much in the UK, save. But certainly one of the things that has to happen is firms have to invest. They have to invest in just maintaining their productive capacity. But being as we are in an economy in which the profit motive matters, they also invest in improvements, in continual technological improvements. And those are potentially quite good things because they increase the productivity with which those goods are produced. And in the process of increasing productivity, they lower the cost of the goods. And so, all other things being equal, we would like to buy more of something that is cheaper. The other thing that investment does for firms is it allows them to continually reconceive their own processes and products, to produce novelty continually. And this was a point that was made quite strongly by Joseph Schumpeter in the 1930s, 40s. The idea of creative destruction, that this process of continually throwing over the old processes, bringing in the new processes, producing new products, is an important part of what it means to keep an economy going. And again, novelty is something that we as households, as it turns out, prize. And so it also tempts us to buy more stuff and pumps the economy in the way that you want it to go. Now, the interesting aspect of that production of novelty up there is it has a lovely, neat match with our own desire for novelty. The consumption of novelty by households plays critical roles in our sort of rather complex social logic, what it means to live in society. One of those roles is an obvious one, the one around positional consumption. So the idea that novelty sends signals to those around us that we occupy a good place in society, that we have high status in society, is one of the things that novelty feeds. It also feeds all kinds of other things. One of them is our dreams and aspirations, that something is new and continually turned over somehow does suggest to us a form of progress. So this production and consumption of novelty, I'm not passing a judgment here. All I'm saying essentially is that these two things are perfect partners for each other. The production of novelty by firms has an inherent partner in the consumption of novelty by households, and that is a deeply entwined economic and social logic that's really important to making this system work. There's another interesting feature of it, which is that it's driven to some extent by anxiety. The anxiety of the firm is that capital will fly from the firm if you're not continually innovating, if you're not at the margins of what is the production of novelty. And the consumption of households goes back to a very interesting thing that Adam Smith once talked about when he was writing about economics 250 years ago, and he talked about the ability to go out in public without shame. What is it? What's the basket of commodities? What's the bundle of goods that we need in order to go out in public without shame? Adam Smith talked about. And in his day it was a linen shirt. In our day it's a whole range of other commodities that contribute to this idea of a life without shame. So a life without shame is in one sense a very honourable and very humanising version of what we're doing as consumers, and in another has the seeds of anxiety sown within it. So it's a system driven by this coupling of economic structure and social logic, driven to some extent by anxiety, and expanded continually over the last decade and a half, particularly by structures of credit and debt, which feed that flow through the system. And it's one of the things, obviously, that went wrong. It's a very good system for all sorts of reasons, except for when liquidity stalls and consumer confidence drops. And then the risk is that this thing which drives itself nicely in that circle in a relatively stable way comes untucked, comes untangled, and becomes deeply unstable. The other thing, of course, that's deeply wrong with this model is it has no sense of the resource implications of that particular economic structure. So there's structure. That's to head that off. I mean, it is a very complex territory. I think the important thing to note to it is how this system has worked quite well in the past, but has taken not enough context of limits and hasn't really understood the way in which the social logic is coupled with the economic structure itself. So we're there, that's complexity. We seem to be almost socially locked in. We're looking at kind of almost beginning to look like impossibility theorems for sustainability. Where is the progress that can be made here? And one of the things that's been very interesting about prosperity without growth is this kind of sense that of being pulled into impossibility theorems and pulled into places which look intractable. And there's many, many prophets of intractability at every stage. The economy has to work this because this is how economies work. Social logic has to be like this because we're born like that. We have innate qualities. The banking system has to work like that because we have to expand the monetary supply. And indeed government itself, the government itself is almost unable to act in the face of these because it has a democratic mandate which it can't go against. And one of the interesting things to me, and I hope it comes out in the report, is that at every stage, actually when you begin to unpack the assumptions of intractability, there is room for manoeuvre. So the rest of the report, and what I will very briefly trot through really, is options for untangling that intractability. And I'll concentrate really on two. One is about economic structure and the other is around social logic. So the economic structure one is fairly straightforward, and it's the biggest call in a way from the report, is to say actually we need different kind of macroeconomics, because actually all our economic theory from the 1930s onwards talks about economic stability in terms of consumption growth. If we want to do something differently, we have to reinvent the way that we approach macroeconomics.